Okay, good evening. Welcome to our Isaiah class. We're going to pick it up in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 13, which says, "And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, and a terebinth or an oak, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains, when it is felled, the holy seed is its stump." Okay, so what we're reading here in this particular section is that a remnant will be preserved. A tenth, a small group, doesn't mean exactly a tenth or 10%, will return to captivity, as we read in verse 13. The remnant will be further reduced to what's known as a micro-remnant. In the final end, or the final result, will be the holy seed that'll spring up from the cut-down stump. And sometimes when a stump is, tree is cut off, branches, trees, limbs, or not limbs, but tree shoots will spring up out of the stump. And here, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about that after this is all said and done, there'll be a remnant, the holy seed is going to come up, faithful remnant. Now, if you go to Romans chapter 11, there's a section here that's discussing the remnant, and we're going to look specifically at Romans chapter 11, verse 5. If you turn over there with me, we'll read here. It tells us in verse 5, it says, So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. Of course, this is talking still about God's people here, but specifically in this section, we're talking about Christians. And Paul's using this as to show us that God has always been concerned with the remnant, those who are faithful to Him. It's not the masses that are faithful to Him, but it's always been the remnant. Now, just like as we talked about before with Elijah, when he went into the cave, God had told him that there was still a remnant that was faithful to him, 7,000 that were faithful. Now, as we cross over into chapter 7, actually 7 through 12 is what's known as Judah's Hope. And these chapters, they comprise the first major section in the book of Isaiah, the prophecies concerning Jerusalem and Judea, as we read back in the very beginning in chapter 1. And these prophecies were delivered during the reign of Ahaz. This was about 537 to 532 BC. And relatively around that area, during this time, Israel, the northern kingdom, had formed an alliance with Syria. And the two kings, Pekah and Rezin, the king of Syria, Pekah, the king of Israel at this particular time, they had joined together to form an alliance to fight against the Assyrians, to defend themselves against the Assyrians. Now, they had turned to Judah, Ahaz and Judah, to try to get him to go in with them, but Ahaz refused. And you can read about this in a lengthy section in 2 Kings, chapter 15, all the way, verse 37, all the way to chapter 16, verse 9, also in 2 Chronicles, chapter 28, verses 5 through 21. We won't read those, but it's good for that further reading and further study in this particular section of Isaiah to get the what's going on politically in the world as far as Israel and Judah and the Assyrians and the nation of Syria. Now, this first section in chapter 7, it would be called, if you want to give it a title, you could probably call it the Syria-Israel, or Israel, which is also referred to as the northern kingdom. And in this section too, it's also referred to as Ephraim. It would be the Syria-Israel Confederacy, the alliance of Pekah and Rezin. Now, you'll find this in chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. Now, Jerusalem was besieged by Syria and Israel. And you see this in chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, where it says, "The days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, son of Ramaliah, king of Israel, came to Jerusalem to wage war against it. But it could not mount an attack against it. And when the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of the people shook, as trees of the forest shake before the wind." This really shook up Ahaz. he's kind of shaken. So were the people of Judah by this. I guess they thought that they could stand and kind of do what they wanted here, but this kind of shook them up a little bit. Ahaz is fearful. You know, great men of faith wouldn't be afraid because they trusted in God. But here Ahaz is fearful because he really doesn't trust in God. And you'll see later on here that he actually trusts in the Assyrians, and he forms an alliance with them. You know, the Bible tells us that perfect love casts out fear. Now, if we have a love for God and a trust for God, then fear is not going to have its place as it would. But here it does, because Ahaz is not a faithful person to Jehovah. Ahaz and Judah, they don't have this love for Jehovah. They've got into idolatry. They're caught up in the physical things of the world, the wealth that they have and the power that they have. And as you see, you know, this confrontation of unbelief and belief in God is what we have. We have a confrontation of unbelief and belief here. And comfort. And as you begin to look down through verses 3 through 9 here in chapter 7, and it tells us, and the Lord said to Isaiah, go out and meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, and your son at the end of the conduit by the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. And he gives very specific directions as to where he's going to meet Ahaz. And then he gives him a specific message to give to Ahaz. And he says, and say this to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear. Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps or firebrands, at fierce anger of Rezin in Syria, and the son of Ramaliah, which is basically talking about Pekah. God tells Ahaz through Isaiah that these are just smoldering stumps. There's nothing to be worried about. They're not any real threat. And if Ahaz would have trusted God, it wouldn't have been a problem, but he doesn't. He doesn't really believe what Isaiah is telling him here. And as you read on, it says, and say to him, verse 5, it says, because Syria with Ephraim, this is speaking of the northern kingdom, Israel, and the son of Ramaliah, which is Pekah, has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set the son of Tabiel as king in the midst of it. Now what they wanted to do, they wanted to, because they couldn't form an alliance with Ahaz, they decided they were going to attack it, and then they were going to put a puppet king in there on the throne so they could control him, and he would throw in with them, and they'd be able to go against the Assyrians. And this is what their plan was. Now, the confrontation of unbelief, Isaiah and his son Shear-Jashub, which basically is the word name translated, means a remnant shall return. They're sent by the Lord to meet Ahaz and to console his fear. And God gives the prophet specific instructions at the meeting place, and there's a specific message here that he's told to give him. And God goes on to instruct and inform Ahaz and Pekah that they're not inform Ahaz that Pekah and Rezin are not any real threat. Like we said, they're just smoldering stumps. No fire, just after a forest fire goes through, these stumps just smolder. They're all burned out. In other words, they were two burned out stumps. And Isaiah informs Ahaz of the intentions of Pekah and Rezin in verses 4 through 6. And when we get down here a little further, God declares the attack on Syria, the Assyria-Ephraim confederacy, would not prevail. And Jehovah would overthrow it. And you look in verse 7 here, and it says, thus says the Lord God, I shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be scattered from the people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria. So basically what he's telling them here is that they're not going to be any bigger than they are. Rezin, he's just going to be there in Syria, and that's it. He's going to be the head of Syria, and Pekah is going to be the king of Ephraim, or Israel, the northern kingdom. And within 65 years, you pretty much won't know anything about them, because after the Assyrians attacked them in a few short years, these people were dispersed throughout all the Assyrian kingdom, including the 10 northern tribes. They were dispersed through the northern kingdom and all around the world. Not the northern kingdom, but through the Assyrian kingdom and all around the world. And as we read on here, it says, Ephraim is the head of Samaria, and Samaria, the son of Ramaliah. If you are not firm in the faith, you will not be firm at all. The Lord spoke to Ahaz. Then he tells Ahaz to ask for a sign. So in 65 years from this time, they weren't, it was just they weren't going to be there. There was not going to be a trace of them. They're going to be all dispersed around the world. The Assyrian Empire, Syria would fall, and so would Samaria, or Ephraim. And Syria and Ephraim would only rule the lands and no place else, and Syria would fall to the Assyrians, and so would Ephraim, the northern kingdom. This happened about 721 BC, that the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And if you look up the annals of Sargon II, king of Assyria, he had talked about in his annals how he had captured some 27,000 northern or Jewish captives from the northern kingdom. And you can read in the scriptures, which the scriptures will tell you that around there's actually more, a greater record in the Bible. You can see this in there. But what had happened was that after Sargon had taken them out of there, some 65 years later, this prophecy came true when Esarhaddon, he sent colonists. He was an Assyrian king. Had sent colonists in to this area, and they intermarried with those who were left behind, and thus the land of Ephraim pretty much ceased to exist. And Isaiah says to Ahaz, if you don't believe this, you will surely not last. And Ahaz, if he believed this prophecy, things would have gone well for him. And Ahaz is pretty much what he's saying. Believe this prophecy and God will deliver, or things will not go well. It's one or two choices, and this is in verses 8 and 9. Now then God speaks again in this next section with a promise of Emmanuel, God, which actually translated means God with us. And this is speaking messianically of Jesus. And you look at verse 10, and we read again, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, and he says, ask a sign, in verse 11, of your Lord, God, and let it be deep as Sheol or as high as the heavens. Ask a great sign, just don't ask something small here, Ahaz. God is telling this to Ahaz through Isaiah. Ahaz refuses, but Ahaz says in verse 12, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Well, it wasn't really the case. You kind of wonder about the character of Ahaz here. Ahaz, here's God giving a direct command here, ask a sign, and Ahaz doesn't want to tempt God, which tells you what? I mean, that doesn't make too much sense from his standpoint. Ahaz refuses, claiming that he doesn't want to tempt God. No one tempts God when God, no one tempts God when they do what God directly commands. And God is directly commanding Ahaz here to ask a sign. So Ahaz he hypocritically refuses to test God. It's a clear illustration of his unbelief, his lack of trust in God, because either, he had or he was going to make this alliance with the Assyrians and ask them for help. You look down here around verse 13, and he said, Hear, O Israel, house of David, it is little for you to worry men, that you worry God, my God, also. This is what he said here. Now, and this is Isaiah speaking here, rather. I got a little mixed up here. So in verse 14, Isaiah goes on to say, Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Now, Ahaz, whether you want a sign or not, God's going to give it to you. And even though Ahaz refuses a sign, God still gives him one anyway. Therefore, God gives him this sign. He says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," which, as we said, means God with us. And he goes on to say, "He will eat curds and honey, and when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, for before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted." Okay, so before this happens, before this sign is given of Emmanuel, that land where Pekah and Rezin is, Syria and the northern kingdom, is going to be deserted. There ain't going to be anybody there. It's going to be deserted. The Assyrians are going to come in. They're going to take the people captive, and then eventually they're going to move some other pilgrims back in who are going to intermarry with those who were left in the land. The ones that were left behind that the Assyrians didn't want to bother with, pretty much is what it amounts to. They didn't want to take them out of there. Now also you'll notice in verse 14 that there's a word here that is translated virgin. And when it says, "Therefore, behold, a virgin shall conceive a son and call his name Emmanuel," the Hebrew word for virgin here is almah, A-L-M-A-H, almah. And it actually means a young maiden. It's feminine, of a lass, or as veiled or private, a damsel, a maid, a virgin. And you can look this up in Strong's H5958. Will tell you what this word means. Now, it's interesting, as Brother Horner put it, C.M. Horner wrote, he said, "Matthew settles the matter forever," because sometimes you'll read, particularly around Christmas time, you're always going to find somebody who's going to take issue with this concept of a virgin. And they'll say all kinds of things about this. But Brother Horner says that Matthew settles the matter on the word alma, which is meant in those days in the first century, which meant to those in the first century for all sense. Okay, so in other words, what Matthew wrote in the first century makes perfect sense today as it did then. Now, he says, "All that was done that might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin shall be with a child, and she shall bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," which translated God with us. And it's very clear in the Greek with the word virgin, that word that it comes from, that we translate the word virgin, that it's clearly speaking of a woman who is virtuous, in the sense of a woman who has not been involved in any kind of sexual activity. This is very clear when you read it in Matthew. Now, should call his name Emmanuel, which means translated God with us. You can see this in Matthew chapter 1, verses 22 and 23. And Ahaz and his court, well, they probably wouldn't have understood what Isaiah was talking about here at this particular time. And they, in fact, the matter of maybe 2 or 3 years, they might have understood with Pekah and Rezin, but it's tough to say whether they even understood that or not. No longer would Pekah and Rezin be a threat. And since Ahaz had rejected God's help and appealed to Syria, in turn God would let Ahaz and Judah have Assyria, which is mentioned here in verses 14 and 15. "And therefore the Lord will give himself a sign, and behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, and he shall eat curds and honey." And as we talked before, he will refuse evil and choose good. And before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. And this is what the prophet Isaiah is telling him before this happens, just in a short time. Pekah and Rezin are not going to be a threat anymore, and the Lord will bring upon you and upon the people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah and the king of Assyria. Okay, so what he's talking about here is that Ahaz had made this appeal to Assyria. And what was going to happen in verses 18 through 25, as you read this was a impending doom, Judah's impending doom and devastation from Assyria. This was what was going to happen to Judah. There was going to be an impending doom and some devastation. Because later on, Assyria was going to come down during the days of Hezekiah, under King Sennacherib, come down and siege Judah. And there'd be some terrible times in the city of Jerusalem. So in the days, he tells us in verse 18, the days of the Lord will whistle the fly, that is the end of the streams of Egypt, and the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will come, and they will settle in the steep ravines, and the clefts of the rocks, and the thorn bushes, and the pastures, and the day the Lord will shave with a razor, hired beyond the river, the king of Assyria, the head and hair and feet, and will sweep away the beard also. In that day, man will keep alive the young cow and the sheep. Okay, so the point he's bringing out here in this section is that God would whistle for the fly and the bee, Egypt and Syria, to trouble Judah, as the armies will be thick as swarms of insects. You think about these hatches and swarms of bugs, particularly bees when they swarm. This is what he's talking about here. They were going to come in. They were going to be this thick. And when he talks about the king of Assyria spoken as a hired barber to shave the beard of Judah, it's pretty much shaving all of him too, not just his beard. This was a disgrace. It was a shame. In other words, Judah would be brought to the point of humility, humbled, shameful. Ahaz, he was going to hire the king of Assyria to help against Pekah and Rezin, and God would therefore hire the king of Assyria for the destruction that was going to come upon him, and read about in verse 20. Now, it tells us this destruction was going to be severe. When you look in verses 22 through 23, it tells us, and because of the abundance of the milk they gave, referring to the young cow and the sheep, he will eat curds, for everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. And they're just basically going to be living off the land, what they could get for products from these animals and from bees, and the land wasn't going to produce much. That's what they were going to have to survive on, those that during that time that this happened. Okay, you read in verse 21, and that day, verse 22 rather, because of the abundance of milk they gave and the curds, everyone who was left in the land will eat curds and honey. This was just basically how they were going to survive, verse 22. There would be severe devastation. The devastation would be severe. Those left behind would have to live off the products instead of the produce of the land. And you look down here in verses 24 and 25, actually 23 through 25, and that day every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. And this land is going to just not produce. Vines are not going to be gone. The vineyards are going to be gone. They're going to be trampled down. They're going to be destroyed. And the only thing that's going to be there is going to be briars and thorns, which are useful to human consumption. I mean, there may be some animals that would eat off of these things, but definitely not humans. And it tells us here in verse 24, the bow and arrows, a man will come there, for all the land will the briars and thorns, will be briars and thorns. And for all the hills that be used to be hoed with a hoe will not come there for briars and thorns, but will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. And it's basically telling us that all this land that was farmed and grew crops, it was just going to become pasture or ranges for cattle and sheep. Now, when we get into chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, he begins to talk about the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria and what's going to happen to them. And then verse 8, chapter 8, verse 1, it says, And the Lord said to me, Take a